Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Ichon, COO. This week's guest is a recording of remarks by renowned historian Victor Davis Hanson. We were honored to host Victor at a recent dinner we had in Napa Valley, attended by more than 175 supporters. Victor discusses his latest book, The End of Everything: How Wars Descend into Annihilation. We thought it was apropos given so many conflicts around the world, from the Russia-Ukraine war to the attack of Hamas on Israel. And so we thought many of our supporters who missed the Napa Valley dinner to listen to this great talk. Victor addresses all of these topics and more. Thanks for listening, and here's Victor Davis Hanson.
Join PRI on Saturday, September 21st at the Four Seasons Hotel Silicon Valley in East Palo Alto for our annual Sir Anthony Fisher Dinner, featuring this year's keynote speaker and Toby Family Freedom Prize recipient, Kimberly Strassel. You read her Potomac Watch column every week in the Wall Street Journal. You see her on TV in her regular appearances on Fox News Channel. And you read her best-selling books like The Biden Malaise. Now, come see her in person at a terrific evening supporting PRI. She'll discuss the 2024 election, what's going on in our nation's capital today, and the fundamental importance of civil liberties. Visit pacificresearch.org/events today to buy your tickets. While you're there, you can learn about sponsorship opportunities. We hope to see you on Saturday, September 21st. Tickets are selling fast, so visit pacificresearch.org/events today to secure your spot.
And I want to also point out that I owe a great deal. I was a professor at Cal State Fresno for 20 years. And John Racian, the director of the Hoover Institution, called me up and said, "We'd like you to come to Hoover. We have a guy who wants to endow your position, Martin Anderson." I said, "Well, why would he want to do that?" He said, "It's the weirdest thing in the world." He says, "There's three things that he likes about you." And I said, "Well, was it something I wrote?" He said, No. He said, "You're Swedish like he is, and you're named after a Marine, Victor Hanson, who died in Okinawa, and he fought in the Korean War in combat. And you're from the Fresno area where his daughter is." And I mention that because his grandson, Blaine Docker, is here tonight with his lovely wife. So I really wanted to point that out. Thank you. There's Blaine. Martin passed away this year at 99. He was one of my closest friends, and I think he was one of the most remarkable people I ever had met. I'd like to speak very quickly about the book for 10 minutes, and then I think it will naturally, fortunately or unfortunately, go into the disaster of the last 3.5 years, and then we can just end maybe with the election. I was always curious in reading about military history that on rare occasions the defeated were not given terms, they didn't capitulate and live happily after. They weren't even subjugated or colonized, they were wiped out, erased. And by that I mean their civilization disappeared, their language disappeared. So I wanted to look at some of these and see, how did that happen? Obviously there was some contemporary worry about the course of the United States in the back of my mind. So I picked classical Thebes that in 335 thought that it would revolt against Macedonia. And unfortunately, this fellow named Alexander the Great pulled up at the walls at the age of 22. And he systematically, in 72 hours, destroyed the oldest city in Greece, the home of Antigone and Oedipus of myth, the great liberator, and it vanished. The language, the Theban dialect of Boeotian, vanished. In 149, in the Third Punic War, the Carthaginians had lost 2 wars, but they had a modus operandi, a modus vivendi of living with Rome. And then, of course, Rome decided they were going to be the masters of the Mediterranean, and this commercial state, much diminished in power, had no right to be a rival. It had been in North Africa since Rome was founded in 752 and Carthage a little earlier, 780. It was a Punic Phoenician colony. And so the Romans sailed in with the largest amphibious force since Xerxes' invasion of Greece. In 3 years, they surrounded the city. Unfortunately for the Carthaginians, they had an authentic genius in Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the famous Scipio Africanus, the hero of the Second Punic War, and they leveled the city. 500,000 people were killed or enslaved. They not only wiped out the people, they wiped out the language, the religion. It's not quite true they sowed the ground with salt. That's a medieval interpolation. But nevertheless, they destroyed the city down to the foundations. If you go to Tunis today and you see that city, that was a Roman copy, Carthago Nova, founded by Julius Caesar. It was a Roman city, but there is no Carthaginian today. The Berber people don't have any affinities with Phoenician. It just simply vanished. Same thing happened of Christendom in the Byzantine Empire. At one time had gone from the Aegean Sea to the Persian Gulf, founded by the great Roman Emperor Constantine and come to its fruition by Justinian in the 6th century. You may have seen Hagia Sophia, the Justinian law code. For 1,100 years, Asia Minor was Western, and it always had been Western. Today, of course, Mr. Erdogan says it's been Turkish forever. It's not true. It was the greatest city in Christendom, and although much diminished on Black Tuesday at 1 o'clock in 1453, the besieging Ottoman forces, 200,000, finally broke through the Theodosian walls. They had never been breached in 1,100 years. When I was writing about this, most of the sources are in Byzantine, Greek, Italian. It was very hard. I mean, it was hard to read, but it was very hard to read for other reasons. That was very eerie that this whole civilization, they had the first-hand accounts of people on the walls. The Genovese came, some of the Florentines, some of the Venetians, and to see these Janissaries pour through, swarm into the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia you see today. They had bolted the doors. There were 7,000 people who were praying to the archangel. They thought he would come down and save them, and they were all slaughtered. And that was the end of. It wasn't quite level because it was worse than that. The DNA of the West was turned into Istanbul. Minarets were slapped on Hagia Sophia, and it became the bulwark or the center of the Ottoman Empire. And today, there is no Christendom, there is no Christianity. The great idea of the 1920s to try to resurrect it failed, and that civilization was completely gone. I just ended the book with Cortez, very different when he landed 1519 into Mexico. No one had any idea who the Mexica, the word Aztec, they never called themselves Aztecs. They called themselves Mexica. But he never had more than 1,500 people at one time, and he destroyed an empire of 4 million. He leveled Tenochtitlan, where modern day Mexico City is, and within 50 years, he enslaved or killed the population, 400,000, leveled it, destroyed the empire. I think you could say within 50 years there was nobody who, maybe it was a good thing. I mean, there was 20,000 people ritually sacrificed per year by the Aztecs, and Cortez would not have been able to do it without the help of disaffected subjects, the Tlaxcalans. But that society vanished. I know if you go to, I was in the bank not too long ago in Selma. It's about 95% Hispanic, and one of the tellers said, "Victor, you know Latin?" And this person's speaking something that we don't know. They're Spanish speakers, and the woman was speaking a Baja dialect of Nahuatl, but you could probably linguistically trace that to the Aztec language. And there's probably people in Mexico who have some remnant, but otherwise it's disappeared. And what was, I was trying to think in the epilogue of the book, I thought, what happened? And there was a commonality among all of these things. All of these civilizations had been very, very powerful. They had visions of eternity. They had long legacies. They had famous ancestors. And they had not taken an accurate appraisal of where they were at that moment vis-a-vis where they had been and where they were going to be. And that means they didn't look at critical areas, infrastructure, finance, manpower, fertility. And they were naive. That was one thing that was in common. The second is they had this reliance on allies. The Thebans were the Thebans. Alexander the Great, Macedonians, they're half educated, they're half Greek. The Spartans will come, the Athenians, they didn't. Constantinople, well, we're half of Christendom. Any moment there's going to be a Venetian fleet that sails up the Dardanelles and they're going to hit Mehmet and the occupying force from the rear and they're going to liberate. They never came. At Carthage, they said the Macedonians will attack Rome. They never came. The Aztecs, after the death of Montezuma, said, well, we have all of these allies. They never came. That was another trait. Another thing that was common is that nobody took seriously what these people said they were going to do. And they were not Attila the Hun or Tamerlane. These were intellectuals. Alexander the Great was a student of Aristotle and Callisthenes. He said he was going to destroy the city. He said, you have 24 hours to get out. I'm going to destroy the city. I'm going to kill everybody in it. I'm going to enslave. But I will leave the house of the poet Pindar as a gesture of flip to my artistic legacy, apparently. And he did. And Scipio said, I'm going to level the city of Carthage. I'm going to destroy everything in it. The Senate has ordered me to do that. And he did. And Mehmet said, when I get done, there's not going to be Christians except slaves or employees of the Ottoman Empire. And he did. And Cortez says, I'm going to level the entire city. And he did. But they had no recollection, no realization, no sensitivity of who they were dealing with. So when I wrote an epilogue, and it's just amazing how many people today threaten people. Mr. Erdogan has threatened the Athenians. He said that the Greeks are going to wake up one day and they're going to see a missile flurry coming from Ankara. He said to the Armenians at the recent ethnic cleansing out of Turkestan and Azerbaijan, he said, we have a solution for you, and our grandfathers in the 19th century knew how to do it, and I will do it better. He said to the Kurds the same thing. He said to the Cypriots the same thing. I've counted 35 times when a high Russian official, general, or media person, or in the government has said he's going to hit not just Ukraine, but Europe or the United States with a nuclear weapon, everyone. Iran has now threatened Israel 3 times, going back to 2020 when Mr. Rafsanjani said, we kind of like the idea that half the Jews are in Israel because it's a one-bomb state. And as these examples in the past, everybody discounts it. Nobody would do that. Kim Jong-un is crazy. He would never send a missile into Seoul. Probably not. But the same type of, I don't know what the word is, naivete is here. And you can see it in the United States today. We think we're preeminent. Putin would never do that. And then you start to look at us in comparison to these past civilizations, and you think, well, wait a minute. We're borrowing $1 trillion every 90 days, and we're paying 5% on it. And now we pay $1 trillion in interest. It's larger than the defense budget. We're short 45,000 troops. And the troops, the demographic that is short, we don't like to talk about that publicly, but it's white males from rural and middle-class America that died at double their numbers in the demographic. And we've ostracized and alienated them. When we look at the border, it's not that it's porous, it's non-existent. We've never seen this before. Nobody's ever seen an open border, maybe since 1850, 1860, or maybe you watch a cowboy movie and everybody goes across the Rio Grande with impunity, back and forth. But there is no border. There's almost as if this administration said, yeah, we let in 10 million people and we destroyed the border and we changed the demographic and maybe the voting, and what are you going to do about it? Vote us out of power? It's going to take you 20 years to solve that problem. Same thing with the budget. They're probably saying you're either going to have to raise taxes or renounce some of the debt or inflate your way out of it. It's going to be that's your problem. And so I think there's this deliberate effort to undermine the United States, and we as conservatives or the public in general doesn't understand how vulnerable we are and the key things that happen. We were once the greatest producer of natural gas and oil. We have more rare materials, resources in almost any country. And yet, as we speak today, we're draining the Strategic Petroleum Reserve on the theory that it's okay to take oil that somebody else pumped out of reserve, but it's a cardinal sin to take it out of the ground. It makes almost no sense. And then you look at, and everybody says, well, America it has deterrence. People have respect for the United States. I don't think they do anymore. When you look at Kabul, we fled Kabul in the worst humiliation since the Vietnam War. Maybe worse than the helicopters in 1975 on the roof of the embassy. We left $50 billion in the hands of terrorists. We let a Chinese balloon come across with impunity in the United States. 30,000 Chinese nationals, mostly males, for some reason suddenly want to come into the United States. I was surprised. I turned on the TV with my wife and they had a Chinese bio lab 10 miles from our farm. And I said to my wife, I used to work at that packing house. And that packing house had Ebola, HIV, malaria, COVID on the floor inside Reedy, California, run by a Chinese national with connections to the PLA. No need to mention the Wuhan virus or the 100,000 people who are killed a year by Chinese imported fentanyl to the cartels. But what I'm getting at is that we have some of the similar vulnerabilities and we're in a state of denial. Which brings me to the third part, and that is, what do we do about it? And I know everybody says, well, the next election is the most important in our lifetime. I've heard that every election, so have you. But I think in some ways there's something to it, because the left always, if you want to know what the left is doing, remember they always project what they say you're doing as what they're doing. If they say you're appointing people that are too far right on the court, you're trying to pack the court, they really do want to pack the court. They want to go to the justice's home and intimidate them. They want to go to the doors of the Supreme Court like Chuck Schumer and say, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, you reap the wind, you sowed the wind, you're going to reap the whirlwind, you won't know what hit you. But yet they'll accuse other people of it. And so when you look at this particular election, it's not really about the Democratic Party of JFK or even Lyndon Johnson. It's not even the Democratic Party of Bill Clinton. They project and say the Republican Party has been hijacked by MAGA. If you look at the agenda of the Trump administration and you put it next to George Bush and most conservatives, you can see differences in regulation, tariffs, but basically it's still cut back the administrative state, smaller governments, less taxes, more deregulation, conservative justices, skepticism about abortion on demand, secure borders. But when you look at the same way at the Democratic Party, did anybody think in the year 2000, nobody thought in the year 2024 that people in the subway would say, all the Jews here that support Israel, you better get out? Or people would swarm a synagogue down in Los Angeles and start attacking people, or chase students at the Cooper Union, or I would be walking across the Stanford campus and seeing a Middle East, by the way, very wealthy Middle East young people with jewelry and perfect American accents, tearing down posters of the Jewish hostages and screaming every single day from the river to the sea, which is, destroy the state of Israel with impunity. So what I'm getting at is that we are in a situation where if you took a dispassionate view of the United States and you looked at the key elements of a society, is the fertility rate. We're down to 1.65 on our fertility from 2.1. We have institutionalized a lifestyle that says if you're a two-parent family with 2 or 3 children, something's wrong with you. The orthodox has become the aberrant, and the aberrant has become the orthodox. And that it doesn't matter whether you agree with me or not, or you're conservative or liberal, just historically, if you're at 1.6, you're in big trouble in terms of fertility. We used to lecture Europe about it. France has about the same fertility rate that we do now. If you don't have a border, you don't have a country. A border means that you have a particular unique history and culture and traditions, and you have no ambitions that you can spread it all around the world because it would only dilute it. But within these confines, you can create a workable system. If you have no border, you can't do that. The idea of Martin Luther King that we were going to make race incidental and not essential to who we are, color of our skin should not matter, content of our character, we've taken that and flipped it all completely backward. All of a sudden, there is, to combat the vestiges of racism, we say you can be anti-race. The good racism is now necessary to fight the vestigial bad racism. And all that, we don't have people with masks and Klan. Those people were easily identifiable. But when I walk across the campus Stanford and I see people with Palestinian scarves hiding their face or masks at every one of these, and what they were saying, if you were to come from Mars and say, these people are saying the same thing the Klan did, but there was one big difference. The Klan was uncouth and cruel and identifiable, and these people are subtle and claiming they're victims. Every one of them thinks they're victims. They're DEI or the Middle East and part of their Marxist binary. They are the oppressed, they are the victimized, and therefore they should be exempt from their anti-Semitism. When you look at this money, we're canceling student debt. We're draining, as I said, the strategic petroleum reserve. We're giving this huge amnesty. No one ever, and we just gave $100 billion to Ukraine, perhaps. No one says for each dollar, like Eisenhower in the Korean War, for each dollar we give out, we have to bring in $1. That is completely out of the vocabulary. I haven't heard a politician since Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton got together and balanced the budget. And so usually in antiquity, and all these examples I made, they were broke. And when a historical society, as I said, gets broke, it either has to renounce the debt owed to people, or it has to confiscate the wealth of people and give them some kind of credit. By the way, we've heard of that from the left. Your 401k should be donated and we'll give you years of Social Security credit, or you have to inflate the currency. And so, in conclusion, this is a very important election because it's not just Republican, Democrat, or conservative, liberal. It's a Jacobin revolutionary movement. And it's a 360, 24/7 revolutionary movement. It encompasses, like the French Revolution, every aspect of our life. Remember, the French removed they renamed the days of the month. They toppled statues. They renamed the days of the week. They took away religion and worshiped the supreme deity or the god Ratio. And this revolution says there's 3 genders. If you don't believe us, then you're culpable. We're going to fault you for that. We've never had a president try to be taken off the ballot by state attorney generals. We've never had 5 suits going after the leading presidential candidate. We've never had that before. We've never impeached a president twice. We've never tried a president as a private citizen. Whatever you feel about this is very new. And it's part of a revolutionary movement that wants to fundamentally, I'm quoting a famous quote, as you know, fundamentally transform America into something that the founders never intended. And historically, it's not new. And what is scary is people stay in denial. They do not understand the seriousness of it. And they do not understand that the United States today is not able or willing or can exercise the global reach and protection and security that most of the other allies. Now, I'll just finish. Somebody said, well, Victor, that's an exaggeration. I said to them, it was just yesterday, a person said this to me on a podcast. I said, do we have control of the major waterways? Suez Canal? The Red Sea? Can you go into the Red Sea with impunity? Can you sail along the Eastern Mediterranean? Can you go into the Black Sea? Is that okay? How about the Persian Gulf? All of those are contested now. And the U.S. Navy, how about the South China Sea? Can we put a carrier between Taiwan and China with impunity? So it's a very scary time right now, and the United States has to have a renaissance and address these existential questions and make sure that, and I'm very optimistic, the historian Livy, who wrote at a similar time, he said the problem with these societies of the West is speaking of his own, is they get to a point where the remedy is considered worse than the disease. And I don't think we're there yet. But when you think of all the correctives that need to be done and all the oppositions that it would incur, your only answer is to press on and keep going and just ignore what they say about you. But you have to make these reforms before it's too late. Thank you very much.
We'll get back to our great guest in just a moment. But first, are you following PRI on Facebook? By following PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, that's all one word, you'll be the first to read free market ideas from PRI's terrific team of scholars on all the hot issues like education freedom, single-payer healthcare, crime, homelessness, green mandates like the ban on natural gas appliances, and more. Plus, when you follow PRI at facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute, you'll be the first to know when tickets go on sale for PRI's must-attend luncheons, dinners, and galas across the state. And you'll be first in line to secure your spot to hear great speakers like Michael Schellenberger, Gordon Chang, Steve Hilton, and many more. So go to facebook.com/Pacific Research Institute and follow PRI today so you'll be the first to know.
All right, thank you very much, Victor and Sally, for your kind introduction. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here with my friend and fellow controversialist, Victor Davis Hanson. Victor is a genuine, what in baseball would be called a phenom. He's a phenomenon all to himself. In the time in which you can take a shower, Victor can write a column on national politics. In the time it takes you to drive to work, he can start a book. And one of the most amazing things about him, of course, is that he not only writes continually for the popular press about contemporary issues, as you just heard, but in between this daily assignments, he somehow finds time to write long, serious, usually historical books. So his controversial quality is not simply that he has said nice things occasionally about Donald Trump or even Ronald Reagan or Winston Churchill, but that he's the most politically incorrect kind of intellectual these days. He is, by his own admission, an ancient historian. I don't mean he's old. I mean he writes on antiquity, and not just that, which is unpopular in its own way, but he writes about. He's a military historian too, so he writes often about war. And he assumes in a way that there is a kind of fixed human nature. And so the story of war in antiquity and in the Renaissance and in later ages is relevant to us in our age. Now, I wanted to say a few things about this, ask him a few things about this new book, The End of Everything. Quite a jaunty, optimistic work, as you can tell. Written, he told me at the table, during the year that he was suffering from long COVID. So it's the COVID book.
I could blame the pessimism on that.
Yes, I guess so. So the end of everything, how war descends into annihilation. Not many best-selling books have annihilation in the title. Let me ask you first, the title contrasts somewhat with a famous book from one of your Stanford colleagues, Francis Fukuyama, yeah. The End of History and the Last Man. This book of his from the early 90s, I think. So what's the difference between the end of history and the end of everything?
Well, there's a big difference. I confess I'm not a big fan of that book because history's not over with. And especially, I'm not sure that his idea that we would all reach a post-Napoleonic Hegelian consensus about liberal democracy and freedom is going to triumph over the world by osmosis or some organic process. But end of everything, it is the end of everything for particular societies, but not for the world. The world always goes on. But one of the ironies is areas that we don't think are going to end do end. And that's very hard for humans to. If we were alive in Greece in 335, we would say, Thebes is the oldest city in Greece. It's the most hallowed. This is where Euripides' Bacchae takes place. This is where the Oedipus cycle takes place. This is where the great Epaminondas who liberated the city-states took. And they would say the same thing about Carthage or Constantinople. But they ended, completely disappeared, gone. But everything else, that was what was the sad thing about it. Alexander felt bad later, so he built a Macedonian city nearby. Scipio felt bad, so he built a Roman city. And Metnet said, I felt bad. What have I done? So I'll just make it into an Ottoman city. Cortez felt even worse, and so he built Mexico City on top of it. But that didn't mean it was gone. It was gone, gone. I'm not saying some of them shouldn't have been gone, but they disappeared and they're not with us today. And this, all of them had much longer longevities than we do today. We're the oldest democracy, 233 years, oldest constitutional system in the world right now. But we've seen things in the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, we've had a terrible civil war in our past, but we've seen things we haven't seen for 70, 80, 90 years, this level of political vituperation and extra legal things that we've not witnessed. It's a stress test to see if we're going to make it.
Well, a striking difference is between the end of history, which, despite the title, presumes progress.
Yes.
That progress is inevitable. It's going to happen. You don't have a choice about it. It's more a question of understanding it, getting with the program, and being prepared to live in a world that's constantly getting better.
Yes, I think the biggest difference I had with that book, and I had written about it, was he does seem to think that human nature is malleable, that with greater education and affluence and globalism and ecumenicalism, it's not quite like a new Soviet man, but there's going to be a new type of person that's going to inhabit these affluent, free societies that, by their very nature, people will want to adopt and emulate. And I think history is more cyclical, that human nature is constant, does not change. I've used that metaphor before, probably shouldn't again, but I remember when I was a little kid, my grandfather, I would irrigate with him, and he did a trick on me. He turned on our electric 15 horsepower pump. We had 1,500 gallons a minute. Big head like this, and then he didn't say anything, and then we went back to the house, and he still had the original hand pump out in the yard, 1 gallon a minute. And so he said, here's a cup. Does it taste any different? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you keep saying that everything changes and your generation is so good. He said, it's water is water. It's just the delivery system. And I think that's human nature. We have a very sophisticated delivery system, but we're still the same people, the Thebans or the Greeks or the Carthaginians. And that's why history is so fascinating. You can learn what people do. And if you don't believe that, you're going to really find yourself in dire straits if you believe that you can change human nature, I think.
Well, here's a question to connect the thesis of the book with contemporary politics, the two sides of your talk for us tonight. In all of the cases you describe, in all the 4 cases you describe, the end comes from external invasion or conflict. And yet, in your remarks about contemporary America, you seem to indicate our biggest problem is internal, an internal loss of faith in our own principles and ideals, and internal decay of character and conflict between factions in the country, domestic political factions. Which is that your analysis, or is there an external threat that you think is larger and more urgent even than the internal one that you were talking about?
Well, the symbiosis is, in all of these cases I wrote about, Thebes in 371 would never, Alexander, no Macedonian would have gotten near it. And Carthage in 200 to 201, there was an army of 60,000 Carthaginians in Italy, and in the space of 2 years, they wiped out 250,000 Roman legionaries in a series of 4 battles, culminating in Cannae. And Constantinople at one time cleansed the entire area of what we would now call Iran and Iraq of its adversaries, and had its reach went all the way down to what is now Cairo, all the way to Morocco. It recaptured 75% of the Western Empire. So obviously, none of these people would have been able to do anything had they been at that state. So there was an internal decay of finance, borders. Usually in the ancient world, the pathology and the symptomology is not dearth or poverty, but affluence and leisure, complacence, the inability to learn from a prior generation who was much poorer or much more hardworking. What were the ingredients that gave your generation? Or as Horace said, we are a generation worse than our fathers, about to produce a generation worse than us. And so in the United States, I mean, we don't call it an invasion, but we have more people living in the United States that were not born here than any time in our history. Probably about 50 million people, were not born. More importantly, we have the highest percentage, we've gone from 13 to 16%, and we're not assimilating and integrating people to the same degree. But we could stop it, is what I'm saying, very quickly. If we just stopped it, we just finished the wall and said you can't do it unless you come legally. And we have the ability to spend 5% or 6% on GDP, and if we were to do that, I don't think Iran or any of our adversaries would, worry too much. They would worry a lot, about what we were going to do. So whatever is happening in the United States is self-induced. Mm-hmm. We have plenty of gas, plenty of food, plenty of oil, plenty of high-tech universities, brilliant people like Elon Musk and in the private sector, Jeff Bezos. But there's something else going on that is making us vulnerable to external enemies. So if we had not to be political, if you had FDR, if you had Calvin Coolidge, they would simply say to the Mexican government, you're not going to send this many people in, you're going to close the border. Or they would say, if you attack the United States 250 times in the Middle East, we're not going to play tit for tat for you. We're going to go to the source of the problem. Or they would say, if we're going to be the arsenal of democracy, we're going to make our own artillery shells, our own missiles. We're not going to import them. And so it's a matter of leadership, and that's a larger question of whether the leadership reflects who votes for them.
Well, you mentioned the arsenal of democracy, which brings up the subject of World War II. One of your recent books was a long, fascinating treatment of what you called the Second World Wars, in the plural. Let's talk a little bit about that, because we just had the 80th anniversary celebration of D-Day. You were over there with a tour group of your own, talking about it. Looking back at World War II after 80-some years, was that our peak as a civilization? Was that our Peloponnesian War or our Punic War? Is that the war that defined us at our best in a certain way? Because the wars since then have all been fairly anticlimactic.
That's the last
at
time
the least.
The United States won a clear war and dictated to the defeated the terms that they would have to accept. There's some argument that the advent of nuclear weapons made that out of date. But the Korean War was a stalemate. I thought we did as well as we could.
Mm-hmm.
Vietnam was a disaster. Afghanistan turned out as a disaster. Iraq had a constitutional government, but just this week we're learning that Iraq is now sending people over to Hezbollah to help attack Israel. Libya was a misadventure that we don't need to discuss. So we haven't, maybe Grenada, but that was kind of we got very excited about that. We haven't really won a war. And so that it begs the question.
What about the Cold War?
The Cold War we did win, and that was not fought, but that was usually because I think that was 2 or 3 presidents won that war. 4 presidents won that war. Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, JFK, and Ronald Reagan. And they created and insisted on deterrence, and they all had the wherewithal to do it. And they didn't, and they meant business. But it's when you look at that generation, there was something about, I know everybody gets tired of the greatest generation, but coming out of the Depression and then going into that war, I remember my father, who flew 40 missions on a B-29, said that, I said, wasn't it hard? Didn't your B-29s all crash in practice? 14 planes out of your 16 plane squadron got shot down. You crashed twice in Iwo Jima. And he said, Victor, for the first time I was getting a great meal. I hadn't had steak in 10 years. It was the best food I'd ever had. They had cigarettes for us. They had everything we wanted. And so it was that generation. And then when they came out of that war, it was this can-do. Look at we're going to build a California aqueduct. We're going to build a California water project. We're going to build a California freeway system. It was always what we can do. So they went to excess, I know. This generation is kind of a Carter-esque scold. You can't do that. Don't do that. You can't do that. You'll offend that person. And we do that into ossification. And that's why we have this, whatever one thinks about Trump is one of the attractions that he does win with non-traditional groups, especially Latinos and blacks, is they feel he's going to cut through that. I can do this. You can do this. There was a little bit of Reagan in that. That was why I was looking back at the Reagan-Carter debate when he said, there you go again. And you looked at, Carter was saying all the things you can't do. And Reagan was just saying things like, there will be no hostages. Well, this is there will be no hostages when I'm elected. It was a confident, we can do it. And that we haven't seen that. We need a generation like that generation. And I think finally, I don't want to be too wordy, but what's scary about it is the classics, the Greek mind said you could see national phenomena within families. That was an Aristotelian idea. So the rise and fall of Athens was within a family. So a Themistocles built the empire, Pericles enjoyed it, and Alcibiades ruined it. And you can see that in your own family. I see it in farming where a guy comes from Armenia. He works like crazy. He builds a beautiful farm. He has a beautiful packing shed. He lives in a little house. His son builds a big, huge house. He wears slacks instead of jeans, goes into the coffee shop, and then the third kid ruins it. And that's kind of where we are, that this third generation, all they do is tear down statues. All they do is attack our founders. They never say, none of you people could go to D-Day. None of you could do that. You couldn't plan it. You're not able to do it. You can't even build high-speed rail. You can't even do a railroad. You make fun of the 19th century. They built a railroad in 4 years across the United States. You couldn't even build a railroad. You can't even get that. We drove up the 99. It hasn't changed since 80 years. And you people think you're something. You can't do anything.
Now, you wrote a book more than a decade ago now, I suppose, called Mexifornia, about the politics of immigration and of liberalism in the state of California. Now that there's at least some evidence that Hispanic youth, especially males and blacks of both sexes, are apparently favorable, or more favorable, let's say, to Donald Trump in the polls, and to the Republican Party even in the polls, than they used to be. Do those data points change in any way your analysis of where we are in California, or what the future of California is going to be?
Well, that book was written in 2002, and it was written living in a community that was then 70%, now it's 85% Hispanic. My family has got a lot of Hispanic members. My brother was married to a Mexican-American woman. My nephews are Mexican-American. And it was a call for assimilation and integration.
Mm-hmm.
And we weren't doing that. The identity politics was retarding it. I happen to feel that it doesn't really, I don't care what an American looks like. I could care less about his race. I do care that he is an American, that if he comes from a different country, then he enriches us with food and fashion and literature, music, but he doesn't enrich us with his version of democracy or court system or treatment of women. That's the core values have to be American. And that's very hard to do when you're bringing in millions of people and the host has no confidence in his own culture. That was the theme of the book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What's happened is, though, after 3 generations, a lot of Hispanic, especially men, are self-employed. And they have gone through the same pattern as the Italians in the early... Italians were all Democrats, then they were self-employed. And as I just talked to a guy not too long ago on email who now has a small business. He was a former police officer. And he said to me, "Did you know anything about this payroll tax stuff?" He said, "You know, I have to post stuff on the side of my car wash. You know how much regulations I have to do?" I said, "Welcome to the club." He said, "Who did this?" I said, "You did. You voted for these people." He said, "Not anymore." And so I think that's one of the biggest things, that if the Latino vote were to go 50% Republican, the Democrats would close the border in 2 seconds.
Right. Okay. Good.
Yeah.
I like that.
We'll get back to Next Round in just a moment, but first, are you getting PRI's regular email updates? If not, go to pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get the facts you need to fight back delivered every week to your inbox. Every week, PRI sends you what you need to know about what's going on in Washington, D.C. and Sacramento, and gives you the free market ideas needed to save our state and our nation. By going to pacificresearch.org and clicking the sign up button, you can sign up to have Policy Alert, our weekly roundup of all the best ideas from PRI scholars delivered to your inbox. Or you can sign up for event updates so you're the first to know when PRI is coming to your community with great events. So sign up now at pacificresearch.org and click the sign up button at the top of the page to get PRI's content delivered to your inbox each week.
So before I turn to some questions from the audience, let me ask you one more about the theme of this, one of the themes of your book, of your new book. One of the most shocking things about it, which I'm sure everyone in the audience noticed in your summary of it, was that in the ancient world, slavery was a commonplace.
Yes.
And in a way was a humane alternative to killing everyone in the defeated city. You would generously, humanely offer some of them a life as a slave for the conquering power. In America, our discussion of slavery is, of course, affected profoundly by our experience of it in an otherwise free society and in a more or less otherwise free world, at least intermittently. And for us, slavery always brings up the question of race and racism, which is not true in ancient slavery. Many times the slaves are the same race, whatever that means exactly, as the conquerors and so forth. What can you tell us to explain that? Why was slavery such a human phenomenon in almost every society in the ancient world, an accepted phenomenon, and now is a particularly egregious moral sin in the modern world, and to some degree even in the post-Christian
It was
world.
very hard to eliminate slavery in the ancient world. There were people, by the way, the rhetorician Alcademius said no man was born a slave. So there was a very strong philosophical tradition that this was wrong. And there was an anti-philosophical tradition, best epitomized by Aristotle, said there is such a person as a natural slave. Slavery doesn't work when he's not the slave. Well, what he was meaning is it was an insidious process because it didn't have the burden, it didn't carry the cargo of racial inferiority. It was an equal opportunity enslaver. Plato was temporarily a slave, we are told. So everybody got up in the morning and said, if I'm in this city and it's captured, I could be a slave. And if you had a young son who wanted to learn geometry and you were a Roman and you conquered a Greek city, and you'd say, I'm going to have the best Greek tutor, the slave, to tutor my son. And the fact that he was a slave had nothing to do with the fact that he was better educated than you were. So there was no idea that slaves were intellectually or racially inferior. And that's why it was so hard to eradicate, because it was, in some cases, not as exploitive. There were slaves in mines that were Thracian, of course, because of mass enslavement during war. But the idea that slavery should be applied to that was something that happened between the 13th and the 19th century, and it was largely a phenomenon of Europeans going to Africa and Muslim people going to Africa and Latin America, and the Spanish going to Latin America. And that oddly created the seed to eliminate slavery, because it endowed slaves with a new idea, and that is, you are a slave, not because you're unlucky, but because of your race, and your culture allowed you to be enslaved. We have sailing ships and gunpowder, and look at you. So you're inferior. And that meant that every slave had to be inferior. And yet people knew that blacks in America, once they read Frederick Douglass. So all of a sudden you were saying, well, wait a minute. There are people who are slaves that are very smart. Mm-hmm. And you said they're slaves because they're stupid or they're from an inferior race. And if that's true, and if that's not true, then the whole system is corrupt, because you're basing the idea that you have the right to enslave somebody because he's inferior. But if he's not inferior to, and he just gets the opportunity and he's your equal, then you have to get rid of the entire process. Where in the ancient world, somebody would say, I'm smarter than you are. Why am I a slave? And the master would say, because you're unlucky. Sorry, could happen to me tomorrow. It happens to you today. Maybe I can free you, maybe I won't. But I never said that you were not the person I am. So that was the irony of it. And as soon as that started to be felt, as soon as race was made a criterion of slavery, slavery was going to be doomed to be eradicated.
All right, that's very interesting and good. Thank you. Now, here's my first question from the audience. Consists of 3 words: Trump, Alcibiades, thoughts? ?
Well, he has a lot of Alcibiades characteristics. Alcibiades is a very good speaker. Alcibiades was capable of saying or doing anything, anywhere, to anyone, at any time, and so is Trump. And Alcibiades had a lot of natural energy and brilliance. If they had listened to him on the Sicilian expedition, they probably would have carried it off, rather than turned into a disaster by exiling them. But there's that same element of genius and energy and recklessness and lack of self-control. The only difference is Alcibiades died in his 40s, and Trump is 78.
8, yes.
So maybe we're told that I was listening to the news tonight on a Democratic left-wing channel, and they were very worried because the commentator was saying, now we got to be careful with this debate. He's got serious people around him now. He's a much more controlled candidate. he doesn't do what he did earlier. That was what they were saying. So we'll see. We'll see. If he's calm in the debate and he says, like Reagan, there you go again, and he doesn't get down into the screaming of the first debate, he'll do well.
Here's a question about foreign policy. Given the growing alliance structure among China, Iran, and Russia, should we focus on creating a new opening to and relationship with Russia as a way of balancing against China in particular?
It sounds like Henry Kissinger asked that question. Remember, Kissinger said in his memoirs, Russia should never be closer to China than to us, and China should never be closer to Russia than to us. Yeah, I think exactly. I mean, if you look at the number of people who these dictators kill, I can't see a moral difference too much between Xi and Putin. Xi's got 1 million people in work camps right now, the Uyghurs. He's absorbed all of Tibet. He's responsible for a virus that killed 60 million people. He's killing 100,000 Americans a year that he knows are taking fentanyl, that he supplies the cartels. So I think in some ways he's much harder on us than Putin is. But that alliance is very dangerous, and we're very incoherent on the Ukraine war. We all know that he was a demon to invade, but we all know what the solution is, but we can't say it publicly. We know that when he took the Donbass and Crimea, they were disputed 60-70% Russian speaking. Crimea had been an independent kingdom, remember, in 93, 94. And Ukraine annexed it before Russia could annex it. But my point is that when Obama was president and he took both of those, it was not the policy of the U.S. government under Obama to take them back by force. It was not the policy of the Trump administration to take them back by force. It was not the policy of the Biden administration until February 24th. Then suddenly, when the failed Kiev attempt was over, then suddenly he said, now it's on to Moscow, we're going to get those 2 sections back. But he was the first president to ever say that. And so I think everybody realizes the New York Times said in August there were 500,000 dead, wounded, and missing. That was 8 months ago on both sides. And if you look at the statistics now, we're right up about the Battle of Verdun. About 900,000 people have been killed or wounded on both sides. And we want to fight that war as a proxy against Putin to the last Ukrainian. And during the Cold War, we had a rule that said we use proxies in Korea, Latin America, the Soviets do, but we do not use a proxy to attack our main nuclear opponent. When Russia tried to do it in Cuba, we almost went to war. So when we say we're going to now give them the wherewithal to hit targets in Russia, they deserve to. That's strategically sound. But that's very dangerous. We've never done that before. And so I think if we had a deal that says Russia failed to absorb Ukraine, but it had Donbass and Crimea, and we will institutionalize that as part of Russia, demilitarize the border, and tell Putin, okay, you got what you wanted, now it's institutionalized, but you can't take anything after February. You go back to before February 24th. And Ukraine will not be a member of NATO on your doorstep, but it's very heavily armed. And you would be very stupid to try it again, because it's going to be even more heavily armed. And it's not a member of NATO. I think there'd be some type of workable thing we could work out with them and then restore relations with Ukraine. Could I just make one last thing? This administration is very incoherent on Israel and Ukraine. If you think about it, it tells Israel, you cannot be disproportionate to win. It tells Ukraine, you've got to be disproportionate. That's the only way you're going to win. Kill more Russians than kill you. It says to Israel, you can't finish the job. You have to have a ceasefire. They tell Ukraine, don't. Keep fighting. They tell Israel, you have to have a coalition government, bring in members of the opposition. We don't like the Netanyahu. We say to Zelensky, you suspended habeas corpus. You outlawed political power. Did you cancel all that? That's okay. no problem. Keep going. And at some point, you don't know what's going on. And Israel is a much longer ally of ours than Ukraine is. I know that Ukraine is very important and we want it to be an autonomous country, but we apply one set of rules. And we also say that Hamas is now a state, basically. We negotiate with these terrorists as if they're a quasi-legitimate government. And we say, you can't talk to the Russians, they're terrorists. They are, but if Hamas is a state, then Russia is a state that you talk with. If Russia are terrorists, then Hamas are terrorists. But I don't understand the two sets of values that we apply.
A question from the audience. What do you think of Putin sending naval ships and submarines to Cuba? Speaking of Cuba.
He's a very devilish, clever fellow. I mean, he's saying to us, isn't he? Why is he doing Cuba? Why not, I don't know, San Francisco or off the coast of Washington, D.C.? He's saying to us, do you remember the Cuban Missile Crisis? You remember we almost went to war? Now, why was that? Because Khrushchev tried to put nuclear missiles to attack your homeland, and he broke the rules. And now you're breaking the rules in Ukraine. You're using Ukraine to attack us. And that's a proxy, and you don't use a proxy to attack your nuclear enemy. So let's hope that he stops it with a show of force.
Finally,
Yes.
one question about the academy, where you've spent a great deal of your life, and it hasn't gotten better. No thanks to you or me or any of, we're not responsible for it because we haven't controlled it or even really influenced it very much. Where is the academy going, and is there any hope for an American Renaissance that you spoke of in your remarks, as long as the academy remains so heavily ideologized, so heavily progressive, so heavily, if I may say so, un-American?
Yes. 25 years ago, I corroborated in a book, Who Killed Homer, about the death of classics with a very brilliant writer, John Heath. And we said one day they would outlaw Greek. We didn't, that was kind of hyperbole. And they have, of course, at Princeton. So there's going to be no self-reform within the academy. It won't happen. There's only two things that are going to happen. One is people, they have abolished the SAT. Maybe they'll bring it back this year. But one thing is happening at these elite schools. They said they had rules in the last 50 years. And it was basically, you won't get in unless you've got 750. You have to have A 4.5 to do our rigorous curriculum. They destroyed those rules the last 3 years. And now if you talk to faculty at these elite campuses, they think, oh my God, I either have to water down the course, inflate the grades. At Yale, 80% got A's this year, Stanford 65. Or I've got to introduce new courses. And then the employer says, wait a minute, if I hire one of these recent Stanford graduates, they don't know anything, and they go right to HR and cause problems. I'd rather get somebody from Georgia Tech. So that's happening as we speak. So many parents call you up and say, I don't want to send my child to Stanford or Yale because they'll come home unrecognizable at Christmas, and they won't learn anything. So that's good. That's a natural, organic. And then finally, to finish, we as taxpayers and the government can do something very quickly. We can tax the endowments. These are partisan institutions. If Harvard University had to pay what you do on income tax, on the income on $50 billion, that would really hurt their operating budget because they use annual giving as part of the operating budgets too. So if we would get out of the student loan business, and if they want to get kids to come, then they could use their endowments to guarantee their own loans. And then we could be reciprocal on the 50% at some campuses. Nationwide, it's almost 40 are foreign students, and they pay full tuition. If we just said to China and the Middle East, you can have as many students in the United States as Americans want to go to your country. But we're not taking 500,000 Middle Eastern students in China from illiberal regimes any longer. A lot of the problems with the anti-Semitism is because of foreign students. And then finally, I really do think the thing that they're most feared of is an exit test. If you just said to these universities, you used to want an SAT to say that you couldn't come to Stanford or Harvard or Yale unless you had this golden SAT, and now you're here 4 years, but we're just going to give one like a bar exam. Everybody who wants to get a BA has to have a minimum SAT score when you leave. I think that would terrify them because I think it would go down.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.